Hello, welcome to Indie Tutorials. My name is Guillermo and I would like to thank the patrons supporting this channel. Let's start to explain a little bit what we have here. This is a brand new Unity project. I have imported ORK Framework version 3. I have imported GameKit controller. Also some of the GitHub add-ons from GameKit controller and the Mixamo animations to have the full experience from the demo scenes for the GameKit controller. Also, I have imported the tutorial assets from ORK Framework just to have some UI prefabs already made, so it won't take longer to create the UI. And if I were to click on the GameKit controller scenes, what we can do here is to open up one of the scenes that are included in the demo. So I will choose, for example, the mansion demo. So let's select it, double click to open up. And we can actually hit play to see that everything is working as expected. I'm using the Xbox controller connected to my computer. There we go. So camera controller is working and player controller as well, right? Okay, so let me hit Ctrl P to go to stop play mode. And the next step will be to create a duplicate of this scene just for work with ORK Framework. So I will go into Save As, then select the tutorial assets, create here a new folder. Let's call this one Scenes, and I will call this scene ORK 3 Mansion Demo. Next, what I will do is, as it says here in this component, remove from scene. That's what I'm going to do. And let's save it once again. Okay, so after that, let's see what we have here. We have this player and game management game object, which contains, I will say this a little bit overwhelming the first time you start digging into it. It has several components and the hierarchy itself is also overwhelming. And I'm going to disable from the hierarchy the show the component because this makes no sense here. Okay, done. So we have inside this player and game management game object a whole hierarchy with HUD elements, the character components, player controller, player camera, and so on and so forth. So my mindset or way of thinking when I want to integrate or use a third-party player controller with ORK Framework is I start with two things. The first one is that ORK Framework needs to spawn the character, which is going to be a combatant in the context of ORK Framework. And the second thing is that ORK Framework needs to disable the input for the player and the input for the camera, depending if you want to execute dialogues or while transitioning scenes or other scenarios that requires the block of the player controller. So by thinking of that, then we know that, for example, we need to start by spawning this character. This is the mesh, but it's inside this hierarchy. Yet again, my approach is to use the whole game object as the combatant to be spawned with. So let's create, or instead of creating, let's unpack this prefab. So let's unpack the player and game management game object, prefab, unpack completely, or I should select unpack only, but let me see if I Ctrl Z. No, it doesn't work. Okay, never mind. So let's go to our tutorials assets folder, click on that one. After Unity stopped doing whatever it's trying to do here, okay, so after a couple of minutes I take it back. It actually rolled back the changes. So let's try it once again. So I will select prefab, and in this case just unpack. So the link to the GameKit controller prefab is already lost now, and after that we can actually rename this game object F2. And let's call this one Alice. Next, in our tutorial asset, I was commenting out that perhaps in the resources folder we could just drag Alice into it, so it will create a new prefab. Anytime soon. What about now? Okay, there we go. So after we have our prefab, we can safely remove it from the scene. Ctrl S to save the scene. Now let's take a look at the prefab itself in the hierarchy. So let's open up the prefab. And as I mentioned, we want to actually handle the ORK Framework Combatant from the root of the game object. So we will end up having our combatant component at this level, somewhere like this. After that, what we can do is to create also our interaction controller, or the ORK Framework interaction controller, to be able to actually start dialogues or interact with items, ORK items I mean, and anything else related to interaction with ORK Framework. ORK Framework will have the option to instantiate this interaction controller if we had a prefab out of it, but I don't want to do so because the interaction controller is not going to be sitting in the root of the game object. Instead, what we want to do is add this interaction controller at player controller level. So if we were to tell in the ORK Framework Editor to instantiate that component for us, then we need to provide this whole hierarchy, which is a little bit annoying on my point of view, and is by having by placing the interaction controller by our own, give us more control about what we are doing here. Okay, so let's go back to the scene. To make this scene ORK Framework ready, the first thing we need to do is to add the ORK. Let's open up Game is Love, Makinom Scene Wizard, and what we need to do is to add an ORK Game Starter. Okay, so we have the ORK Game Starter. The position, it's not relevant, it can be anywhere in the scene, it doesn't matter actually. We are already telling that we want to start or use this project asset and to start the game right away. What is missing here is what we can do is to create our start schematic asset to actually spawn our Alice player. So let's start doing that. Okay, so let's save the scene once again. Now we can open up the ORK Framework Editor or Makinom Editor. The first thing we want to do is in the base control settings. Then we have the game controls. We can see our ORK control settings. Scroll down, and for the player controls, click on None. As well for the camera controls, click on None. So that will skip creating the player controls and the camera controls for us. Save the settings, and we are going to come back to these settings soon. Alrighty, so the next step is go into combatants, the default combatant. Let's rename it to Alice. Click OK. Now in the base settings we need to assign our prefab in the prefab settings. So let's just drag the prefab over here. That's all we need to do in order to make Alice ORK Framework Combatant. We are going to be reusing the stats. Let me save the settings. For the time being, I mentioned we are going to reuse the default stat value that is creating for us, so HP, magic point, experience, attack, defense. And after saving our changes, we can go to schematics and let's create our spawn schematic. The node we want to add here is the join group. Link the nodes up, select the join group, and we want the combatant to be added to the active player group. Then we can select, in this case, our combatant. We only have one, which is Alice, and we can leave all the settings as they are. After adding this combatant to the active player group, we can spawn it. So let's select spawn. If I can type, not spawn player, this is Makinom. We want to spawn ORK player. And we want to spawn it at spawn point 0. So as you can tell, we need also to add a spawn point in our scene. But for the time being, let's save this schematic. I will go to our tutorial assets and I will create a new folder, and call it schematics. Oops, my bad. Schematics, and I will call this one spawn Alice schematic. Okay, so let's close up Makinom editor. Now we have the schematic. We can assign it to our start schematic asset. So let's try to find it, and it's there. So let's save the changes in the scene once again, and as I mentioned before, we need to add a spawn point, right? So let's select the place we want to add this spawn point, and we are going to see some issues that we need to solve along the way. So from here, let's add, or actually go to Game is Love, Makinom Scene Wizard, create game object, a spawn point. So it's been created at this path here, this position. Click F to focus the game object, and we can move it and place it in a better place. Yeah, so near the ground. What I do here is also to uncheck place on ground. I want that to be handled by GameKit-controller, not ORK Framework. And also I don't want to have these fractions here, so I will just type -30, not -1 but 0, and -70, why not? Okay, click on save the changes in the scene. So at this point, if we hit play, we should be able to spawn the player, but you will see what I meant about having some issues that we need to solve. Okay, so let's hit play. And you can see that the player is falling the ground. The reason for that is that the game object, the Alice game object, is being spawned in the place of the spawn point, which is what we want. But the mesh itself, or in the hierarchy of Alice, if I were to click on this game object to find the mesh itself, inside the player controller we have the gravity center, we have the COM, and then we have Alice. And you can see that it has an offset from the player controller itself, which is causing this issue here, that we are trying to spawn the player in one place, but the mesh is spawning with an offset. So we can handle this by changing that offset in the prefab itself. Click stop, and let's open up the prefab. Once the prefab is open, we can navigate in the hierarchy, and we can see that the player controller has an offset, as well as the camera controller. Anytime soon, Unity, please. Okay, thank you. And we can see that also there is an offset in the transform of the camera. So What we need to do is just to zero out the position. This is going to be a long video for no reasons. And finally, let's set. Okay, so my guess is for every change we do in this game object is trying to serialize everything that is inside it. That's why it's taking that long, recompiling or whatever it's doing. We need to do the same for the player controller. So let's wait for Unity, serialize. And next time what I'm going to do, instead of typing 0 in each, no, I don't have even access to the context menu. Let me see if I can click on this one. I know my laptop is not the best, but this is too much for me. I will pause the video. Okay, now it's zero out for some reason without any, I haven't to type, or I didn't see actually the context menu, but anyways, I'll take it. So let's Unity compile once again or serialize the game object. So we can try once again, zero everything, make sure we save the prefab. And let's try once again. So let's go back to the scene view, or to the scene, I mean. Hit play. And there we go. Now we have the player spawning at our ORK Framework spawn point. We can still have control of the player, and if we see the hierarchy itself, now we have our combatant component added. So now this player is ORK Framework friendly, right? So the next step that we are going to cover is blocking the player control and camera control when ORK needed to, by adding a simple dialog. The first step is to determine which component we need to tell ORK to disable, right? So let's do that. Okay, so if we go back to the Alice prefab, we can see again, if we open the prefab in the hierarchy, from the player controller game object, as soon as it opens, let me collapse all these components. Right away you might think that, okay, we need to tell ORK to disable the player controller, but no, we can scroll down and start collapsing all the components inside this player controller game object. Let me spare this pain, and I will pause the video until I find. Okay, so after a little bit we can see that there is this player input manager component in the player controller game object. What also we could also think that, okay, so let's tell ORK to disable this player input manager, but that's also an NA. There is a down below this input state, input enable. This is what we want to interact with. Thankfully, there is an inbuilt function to do that for us, so we could not just tell input manager input state in this variable to true or false. So let's do that. But instead of going into the ORK framework, let's open up ORK editor. And if we go into the base control, then into the game controls, and then we click on the player settings, and if we scroll down we can see control behaviors, add custom control, the control behavior will be to, come on, blocked by player, and we are going to build a custom script that will serve as a bridge between the GameKit controller and ORK Framework. Okay, so this is where we want to place our script that we are going to create right now. Otherwise, you will have to once again tell that you want ORK Framework to find this input manager script by telling the whole path it needs to follow. So it's a little bit of error prone because it's, you could have a typo, and of course it's just a whole string that needs to be serialized, which I don't like. But anyways, let's save the settings right now, even though we're still missing this class, just to be able to close the editor and go to our scripting step. Okay, so once that was closed, let's go to our tutorial assets folder. I will create a new folder, create folder scripts, and inside the script folder I will create a new mono behavior, and I will call it ORK GKC for GameKit controller player control. Let Unity compile, and before even trying to open up Visual Studio, since we are still with the prefab open, I will add the script to the Alice game object right away. Boop, like so. So now I will double click to open up Visual Studio. I might need to pause the video to spare you the agony of waiting. Alright, so after Visual Studio open up, what we need to do is to create a variable to hold this player input manager from a GameKit controller. So as always, I will create a serialized field. Let's call up private, this is player input manager from GameKit controller, and I will call this one GKC player input manager. There we go. And since we know that ORK Framework, what it wants to do is just to enable or disable this behavior, this mono behavior, we need to call the onDisable and the onEnable method from the mono behavior. So when we disable this component, we want to call in this player input manager the set player input enable state, right? And we set it to false. Let me copy the whole line here, because when we enable back the game object, the mono behavior, we want to set it to true. And that's all we need to block the player controller from ORK Framework. I'm setting this serialized field. I'm not going to instantiate it or assign it in the awake or anything else. I will leave that to the game designers. So if something goes wrong because this is missing, you will get an error. So this is intentional. Let's go back to Unity. Let the script compile. Anytime soon. Okay, so let's go back to Alice Prefab, the root of the game object where we set our behavior, and the only thing we need to do is to assign the player input manager. And we can do that by just dragging the player controller, because we know the script is in this game object. So if we do that, it will automatically find the player input manager, like so. Now, to be able to test this behavior, we need to go back to the Makinom editor to tell ORK Framework to disable this ORK GC player control component. So let's open up once again Makinom editor. We are back into our base control, game controls, player settings, control behaviors, and the first control behavior we added. So in this case, we just need to add here the name of our class, which is ORK GKC player controller. ORK. And by refactoring, it already finds the class name. So that's all we need. Let's save the changes, confirm. Let's close up the editor for now, and let's continue now. The next step to be able to test this feature is to create an interaction. So let's create a simple dialogue between the ORK Alice player and an NPC. See you on the next session. So to be able to interact or start dialogues, ORK Framework dialogues, or ORK Framework interactions at all, we need an interaction controller. We cannot add the interaction controller at the root of the game object because we saw that it could be an offset. Also, let's say that we have root motion animations, so then the player controller itself will be offset to the Alice root game object. That's the reason in this case we need to add our interaction controller in the player controller game object itself. So let's expand this game object. And what we can do here, down below we have the swim capsule. Let's add it just there. So let's create an empty game object. Let's call it interaction controller, as soon Unity let me do. We need, of course, to add the component to this game object, so we have either the option to do so by opening up the Makinom scene wizard, and from here let's select add component and let's type interaction controller 3D. So it already added for us a box collider with is trigger enabled, a rigid body with also is kinematic. It also changed the game object layer to ignore raycast for us, and of course the interaction controller itself. So from here we can select also check the interact with nearest. We could at any point ignore the Y distance, but I will leave it as it is. And I will leave also as it is the any interaction. So now, still by selecting the game object, press F to focus the game object on scene. And we can see right now, let me minimize or reduce the size of the gizmos icons. We can see that our interaction controller is at the root of the mesh itself. So let's actually move it on the Z. I'll say 1, come on, and also 1 on the Y. And we can check the collider as well. Well, it looks fine to me. We can leave it as it is. So let's go back to the scene itself. Let's save the scene. It seems to be expecting some updates. And we can run a quick test just to make sure that our interaction controller is not colliding on anything else from the game kit controller, sorry. But yet we need to go to the Makinom editor, and in the game controls interaction settings we want to use the interaction control, right? The interaction key will be the accept key, which is in this case the return key, so we can leave it as it is. Let's go back to game controls, interaction key. So if we were to instantiate the interaction controller from ORK Framework, this is the place we will do it. so add automatically, but we can leave that as it is, right? So let's save the changes, nothing to save, thankfully. And let's continue now building the simple dialogue to test the player control block. Okay, so to make the interaction dialogue and the HUD, we need to go through all the process of setting up the ORK Framework UI. So I did that beforehand. So here from the Makinom editor, in the UI section, I have set the system type to Unity UI. I have assigned the standard default prefabs like we have done in previous videos many times. I also went into, let me see, UI layers. I have created a HUD layer for our interaction notification. Remember that the order of these layers is really important, determining the order the canvases are going to be drawn from ORK UI system. So in this case the HUD will be in between the layer 1 and the screen fader, being the screen fader the topmost UI layer. In the UI layouts, nothing to change here. Then in the UI boxes, I also set up the default prefab here. Again, these are coming from the ORK Framework tutorials resources. I had then created this UI box button dialog. So if I were to double click on that one, it's just a customized UI box page, but wider in the bottom of the screen to hold the whole dialog system here. Okay, nothing fancy on it. Later on in the HUD section, I have created the interaction HUD, or I created a HUD with the interaction type, then set down below the layer from which the Unity UI will draw this prefab, and the prefab itself that we are going to show. Once again, this is just one from the tutorials, as we can see here, pixelated text and a simple box. Okay, so that's everything I did regarding the UI system in preparation for the next step, which is create the schematic for the dialog itself. So let's get into it. The first thing we need to do here in the settings of the schematic itself is tell it to block player control and block camera control. Scroll down and we need to add a couple of actors. So the first actor is going to be our ORK player. The ORK player doesn't have a scene object, so we can safely uncheck that one. And the second actor we want to add is actually the actor containing or the game object containing this schematic, which is going to be our NPC. So we can leave machine object as it is, as the actor type. Yet again, this won't have a scene object name, a scene object component, but we want to set the name to, let's say, Ethan, like so. The first node we want to add is the show dialog node. So let's start typing show dialog, link the nodes up, and from here we want the dialog type to be message. We want to wait for the message to be displayed before continuing. Then from the UI box we want to select the UI box button dialog, the one I showed you before. The next thing we want to setting up here is the use speaker. So it's going to use the ORK player speaker. We want to show the name of the speaker. And in the message content we can click on edit and type any message we wanted. So for example, hello there, handsome. Handsome. There we go. After that, since we check the weight, we need to close this dialog in order to continue. And what we want to do is call the rotate to make Ethan rotate to the interactor. So from here we can leave the rotating object a machine object. We can set the rotate component to auto, and let's lock the rotation in the X and Z and only rotate in the Y. We can leave the time between to 0 and weight check between. Then from the rotation target, the upward direction, let's keep at direction up, and for the rotation target, in this case is going to be the game object from the NPC. Not from the NPC, but it's going to take the reference of the game object, and in this case, which game object? The one starting the interaction. Okay. Next, we want to fade to make this rotation move smooth. So let's add a time here to, let's say, 0.5 seconds, and let's add an interpolation of quadratic in. After the NPC has rotated to the ORK player game object, we can add another dialog. So let's, or actually we can copy this one. So let's copy, move it over here, link it up. So we can reuse the dialog type, the UI box, but in this case, down below, the use speaker will be to set to actor 1 Ethan. We can still check the show name, and let's change the text of the message, and let's type something like, oh hi, what's up girl. Click OK, and since yet we still have this weight checked, we want to close or accept the dialog to be closed. So let's save our schematic into the schematics folder we created before, and let's call this one like simple dialog schematic. At this point we can close up ORK editor, and now let's create our NPC. Okay, so let's go back to our main scene, and from the GameKit controller there is the prefabs folder. Then from here we have the AI folder, so let's open up. Then we have the dummy AI, and there is this dummy character which is using already the Ethan character from Unity. So let's drag this prefab into the scene. I will do the same thing about going to prefab and unpack the prefab, so the link between this game object and the original prefab will be broken, which is intended. I will rename this new game object into NPC Ethan, and I will create a new prefab out of this game object and place it into our resources folder. But before doing that, let me collapse all the game objects, components this game object has. And from here what I'm going to do is open up GameIsLove Makinom Sim Wizard, and then I will select add component, and I will start typing interaction, add component, add machine, interaction machine. There we go. So the things we need to change here or configure, we want this interaction machine, the start type to be interact. Next, we need to assign our schematic, so let's click on this button to assign the simple dialog schematic. We can leave the execution type to single and the update type to update. We can scroll down to see the remaining configurations here, but we actually are going to leave everything as it is by default. So after adding the component, we can go into our resources folder and drag the NPC Ethan into it, just to make a prefab. Yet again, this NPC is not a combatant or combatant, it's just something that we are going to use for interaction. One thing though we want to change is the transform position of this component, because we cannot see it anywhere here in the scene. So let's change the X into -60, Y is okay 0, and then we can set the Z to -72. And let's select the game object. Oh heck, what did I change then? No idea. Let me control set. Okay, no worries, I was actually changing the prefab itself. So no, actually this should be always 0, 0, 0 and 0. Then we can change anything else in the instantiated prefab itself. So let me make sure now I'm clicking the game object in the scene, and from here then I can actually go -60, -72. Now it's over here, and let's change the rotation to 0. Click on F key to frame, not here but in the game object, and then the scene, F. So it is floating, not in the ground, so let's move it -1.4. Yeah, good enough. And click on save the scene. So now let's test our dialog. Okay, so let's play the test. And let's go to Ethan. And there we have our interact notification. If I press the return key, I get the dialog show. Hello there, handsome. Oh, hi. What's up, girl? And we can see Ethan rotating towards the Alice player. And you may notice right away that there is a warning that there are two event systems. So one created with GameKit Controller UI and the other one created by ORK Framework. So we want to decide which one we want to use at the end. We can only have one in the scene to avoid this warning. And also you might want to hide the standard UI from GameKit controller when showing the dialogues or other type of UI from ORK Framework. So let's see how we can do that. Next, let's stop. The first one is easy because we just need to decide, in this case, let's say if we are going to be working with the GameKit controller, we might need or may want to have their UI govern addition of the event system. So let's go here into the UI settings, and here in the Unity UI settings, event system is set to default. Let's click on this drop down and select none. That way ORK Framework will try to detect the event system already created in the scene by GameKit controller. So let's save the changes. Close up the editor for now. Now to hide the GameKit controller HUD, there are two options, which is one which is a little bit more convoluted, because let me hit play just to explain a little bit. Convoluted in the way that each system in GameKit controller handles its own UI. So for example, if you wanted to hide the game controls settings, there is a game or system controlling this one. There is another system controlling the slots here, another system controlling this part and the navigation. So the second option will be to hide everything altogether, which I think is the easiest way. This is what we are going to implement now. But either way, let me show you where you can find, for example, these settings to hide this portion of this UI, in case you want to do this in an independent way, just to hide portion of them and not all together. So if we were to go to the Alice prefab again, I will select it from here, and then HUD Elements. We can see that this whole thing, these HUD elements, if I were to toggle this, we can see that all these elements are hidden. So this is what we are going to implement, just hiding and unhiding this section wherever we wanted to show the dialogue without the HUD. But if you wanted to only hide some parts of these elements, then you need, for example, to go to the other player systems, and let me see, abilities, let me see if I can remember what is elements on scene. Yeah, for example, player info panel on a screen system. So each system has this panel on a screen enabled, so you need to uncheck that one using the same approach we did with the scripts. For each system you want to hide the UI when showing ORK dialogues, but I think it's easy and enough just to do it all together. So let's implement that one. Let's click on Ctrl P to leave play mode, and we can reuse our custom script to do the same thing. So let's open up ORK PlayerController in Visual Studio once again, and from here let's add another serialized field, private game object, and let's call this one GKC HUD Elements, game object. Okay, so what we want to do in this case is not add it here in non disable and non enable, but let's, because we don't actually want to hide on hide whenever the player control is blocked, but let's do it in a more controlled way, which will be creating a public void function or method and call show HUD Elements, and from here we can call from this game object the set active to true, and similarly we want to create another method, for example, to control to hide it, so public void hide HUD Elements, and what we can do is the opposite and set it to false. There are 100 ways of doing this. I mean, it's just one of them. We can just add a toggle and set this false to true depending of the actual state of the game object, but yeah, this works as well, so let's use it. So when we want to hide or show the elements, whenever we start the dialog and end the dialog, right? So let's now go back to the resources, no sorry, the schematics, or let Unity compile the script. And let's go to the schematics, and then open up the simple dialog schematic. So right away, let's add the space in between the settings and the show dialog. So here is where we want to hide the HUD, and after the last dialog we want to show the HUD once again. So for that we are going to use the call function node. There we go, let's link it up. So from the settings of this call function, we know the class origin is a component, a mono behavior. We need to put here the name of this mono behavior. In this case is also our ORK GameKit controller player control, and the function name to hide the HUD elements is called hide HUD Elements. Then it is asking us if we want to add any parameters, but we are not using parameters in this method. It's explicitly hiding the HUD. So the next question is asking us is which is the target, who has this component, right? So in this case it will be our actor ORK player. And of course we want to wait until this call or function executes in order to continue. Then to show back the HUD, we want to copy this node to the end, and let's link it up. And in this case what we are going to do is the opposite, which is show HUD Elements. So let's save the schematic. We are not done yet. You may notice that now in our script we might have a new element slot in the inspector. So let's go back to the prefab for Alice, and now you see ORK GC player control, and then we have these HUD elements. But of course it's inside the prefab, so we must open up the prefab itself in order to assign this game object. So anytime zoom. Okay, so once it's open, let me collapse, and then we have these HUD elements. So let's drag it up over here. Let Unity understand that we assign this element here. I will appreciate if you can drop me a line in the comment if you see that this is normal. I know I understand my laptop is not well, it's a potato laptop, it's really old in terms of what we see nowadays, but yet anyways, let's go back to the scene, and after doing that, let's give it a try. Okay, so let's give it a try. Anytime. Okay, so let's run towards Ethan, and I start interacting, and the HUD is hidden except for the input map here. This is a special case, I will say, which is not inside the HUD elements, so let's fix that up really quick. If I remember correctly, in the Alice prefab, let's open up. Anytime. So if we were to open the prefab, we need to click on Other Player System Experience, and here in the Essential Components we have the player input panels, and then we have this player input panel system. So we can either uncheck that one to hide completely this control map if we don't want it to be shown at all, which I guess is something that you want to remove from your game anyways. So this is a special case where this component, this prefab, this map input panel canvas is being instantiated, so it's not bound to the HUD elements itself. So now if we save the prefab and go back to the scene, let's hit and play and perform the last test for today. Play. Then the input map is gone now for good. There we go. So this is the first step I always follow in order to add a third-party player controller with ORK Framework. I would not say it's an integration itself yet, but these are the first step I always follow. If you have any other workflow and you want to share it, please leave your comments in the description, in the comment section, sorry. And I'd like to thanks the patrons and for the support given so far. See you on the next one, where we are going to continue adding more functionality to this implementation. Thank you all.